All right, welcome back to another episode of BYU-I Fish Guy. My name is Daniel Rosso, your host, a student of fisheries biology and ichthyology here at BYU, Idaho. Today, I want to continue my discussion that I started on lampreys to include more details and to also clarify some things about their biology that might not be very easily understood at first. In the illustration I drew last time was pretty much mostly accurate. It was a bit exaggerated. Lampreys do have an anal fin. In fact, if you look at the basic anatomy of these fish, you can see the typical, oral disc. And that oral disc, of course, looks just like this. Well, not just like this because it's not quite a perfect representation, but it's just a circular mouth, no jaws, that has a series of concentric teeth that go around in a circle, hence the term cyclostomata for these fishes. Basically, a lamprey is a very eel-like fish without true jaws, but many rows, circular rows of rasping teeth. They have very unique gill openings. They have 7 total on either side of their bodies, and what we call a buccal cavity in the area that we would typically refer to as the throat in, say, a human or some other vertebrate. These are very unique among lampreys, just 7 gill holes. They don't have the complex gill system that we find in other fishes, specifically the bony fishes that are found here in the freshwaters of North America. They don't have the branchiostegal rays. They don't have any of the operculum, the gill covering. They don't have the preopercle, nothing like that. It's a very simple design anatomically, just a simple respiratory mechanism of exchanging gases, of simply breathing in the dissolved oxygen in the water. They, of course, have a single nostril on the top of their head, between their eyes, right about in this region up here, just right in front of the eye. They also have a pineal eye, and that pineal eye is, of course, just an extra sensory organ that they use. Lampreys also lack a lateral line. You cannot see a lateral line anywhere on a lamprey's body. It's a very strange fish compared to many others for that reason. Lampreys, of course, don't have any paired fins. They have no pectoral fins, no pelvic fins, no fins like that. They do have the median fins. They have a dorsal fin. In some species, the 2 dorsal fins here are connected. In some species, they're not. It all depends on the species of lamprey. Regardless, the second dorsal fin, or in some species, the entire dorsal fin, is continuous with the diphyscersal tail or caudal fin. And in some species of lamprey, I've just generalized it with this drawing, there is a small anal fin that continues about midway through the body, usually right about where we see the space between or the connection between the 2 dorsal fins. So the illustration I had in my previous video was very exaggerated. The anal fin is usually, in fact, it's really never that big in a lamprey. That's more like what you find in eels. But they do have an anal fin. They have all of the median fins you would find in most fishes. What I find really fascinating about lampreys in terms of their fins is the diphyscersal tail. And as mentioned in the previous lecture, a diphyscersal tail consists of a tail where the vertebral column actually continues to the very end of the tail, and the 2 halves of the tail are mostly symmetrical. So it's a very unique tail. And of course, this drawing is not really perfectly accurate, but it mostly represents what we find on the tail of a lamprey. It's a very unique tail. Lampreys are the only fishes in North American freshwaters that have a diphyscersal tail. It's a very complex word, but if you say diphyscersal a couple of times, I'm sure you'll remember it. It's very complicated. In fact, I'll spell it for you. It's just di, meaning 2, 2 halves of the tail, or 2 parts to the fins themselves, and physersal. The term cersal or circle is used a lot in ichthyology. It's used very specifically when we're talking about the shapes of tails. We'll get into that in another lecture about the general anatomy of fishes in North America, but it just means tail, part of the tail. Heterocircle means that there's a very big lobe in the upper region of the tail and a smaller lobe below, or flipped, larger lobe that's down and a smaller lobe that's upper. But circle just is in reference to the fish's tail. We'll get into that in more detail. But diaphycircle or diaphycircle is the term that we use to describe the tail of a lamprey. So now that that's out of the way, we can begin to describe more about the general biology of these fishes. I covered a lot of that in the previous lecture, but I want to basically make an improved video in this lecture because the illustrations I had that were green were harder to see, and I want to have illustrations that are easier for people to see. So lampreys have no scales on their skin at all. They're very interesting, very much like eels in that sense. They have no scales. They have a very slimy skin. And they swim very similar to eels with a very side-to-side, snake-like pattern through the water. One thing that I find very fascinating about lampreys, in particular their biology and even their classification, is that they are pretty much the most unique and most primitive fishes that we find here in North American freshwaters. Depending on the classification system that you use, there are pretty much anywhere from about 18 to 20 or 22 species of lamprey found here in North American freshwaters. I'll say around 20 species for the sake of this video, even though some taxonomists would have my head for that statement. That's the nature of taxonomy. Lampreys in North America are part of a family that includes 42 species worldwide found in the Northern Hemisphere. There's 46 species of lampreys altogether that are found in the world, so 4 of them are found in the Southern Hemisphere, 42 in the Northern Hemisphere, hence the term Northern lamprey. So Petromyzontidae is the family to which they belong. And of course, the order Petromyzontiformes. And Petromyzontiformes is just the overall order that includes the family Petromyzontidae, and pretty much all the lampreys that we study are found inside this order Petromyzontiformes. The very first fishes that we could call agnathins or jawless fishes appeared approximately 500 million years ago in the fossil record. And these fishes were very different from anything we see today. They were descendants of ancient invertebrates like Macaia and other strange creatures. Lampreys and petromyzontid fishes appear in the Pennsylvanian time period of the Carboniferous period, because the Carboniferous in geological history is divided by the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian. So around 300 million years ago, we find the first fossils, the first true fossils of a petromyzontid fish anywhere in the world. And that is the group that lampreys represent. Lamprey biology is a very interesting process. And I want to explain a little bit more about specifically their feeding mechanism. I have with me this model of a lamprey. This is a typical model of a lamprey, of a species that's actually the only species of lamprey found here in Idaho. It's called the Pacific lamprey, or Entospenis tridentatus. Very dark in its coloration on top, very dark blue. Sometimes it can look grayish or even brown, with a very light ventral surface. And as you can see from this model, which is much more accurate than my drawing, although I do like the tail in my drawing better than the tail of this model. It's pretty good. You can see the oral disc with all the teeth in its circular concentric rows. You can see the eyes right there on the top of the head, the apertures for the gills, the openings on the side of the body, in the buccal cavity for the lamprey. And you can also see that there is no lateral line present on this particular fish. It's very, very strange. You see the dorsal fins separated in the Pacific lamprey, and the continuous dorsal and diaphysersal caudal fin, which is in a sense similar to eels, which are not closely related to lampreys, but morphologically they look very, very similar. We'll get into eels later as the lectures progress. But this is a typical outline of a lamprey, what they usually look like. What I find very interesting about lampreys is that if you look specifically inside that mouth, you see all the teeth, but there's also a tongue tooth And that tongue tooth is what they use to pierce through the flesh of their victims. They literally swim along, they latch on to their victim, and that tongue tooth is used to pierce into the flesh. And after it pierces into the flesh, they then suck out the bodily fluids from the prey. Typically, lampreys will latch on to a salmonid. In the Great Lakes area, the sea lamprey has decimated the population of lamprey of the lake trout fishery that we find. They usually attach themselves on and they can stay there for a while, just sucking out all the blood and the fluids. And eventually the fish or whatever it attaches onto, which is usually a fish, will either die or it'll just become very weak and die anyway. So it's a very sad fate for whatever the lamprey attaches onto. But I find it fascinating. I think this whole process of lampreys latching onto their prey is a fascinating one. And I think it's intriguing because they're the only fishes in North American fresh waters that do this, that are actually parasitic in a sense and suck the blood and fluids of their victims. As mentioned in the previous video or lecture, there are different types of lampreys. There's non-parasitic forms, there's parasitic forms, and the Pacific lamprey, which is the one we're going to talk about more specifically today because it's the only species found in the state of Idaho, where BYU Idaho is, of course, is a parasitic form. And we're going to describe the basic life history, biology, and ecology of this species in particular. And we'll go through different species of lampreys, and we'll talk about other forms of fishes later on. But today, we're going to focus on this beautiful fish that's scientifically known as Entosphenus tridentatus, which is, say, the Pacific lamprey. What makes the Pacific lamprey and other lampreys so interesting in their biology? Well, it's their life cycle. The life cycle of lampreys is very interesting. There are some forms that are potamodromous, which means they live specifically in rivers and are only freshwater forms. There are others that are anadromous, and much like salmonids, which we'll talk about later, they live in both fresh and salt water, and primarily live in salt water, but they spawn in fresh water. The life history of a lamprey is very unique, however, compared to that of a salmonid. Whereas salmon and trout typically spend, especially the Pacific salmon, spend most of their lives at sea, much of the life of a lamprey is actually spent in fresh water as both a juvenile and as an adult. And we'll get into that in a minute, talking about the basic biology of these fishes. But I just think it's fascinating how their mouths are shaped like that. You'll never find a fish or a family of fishes in North America with a more unique mouth and pretty much with a more unique biology than this fish called the lamprey. It's a very simplified fish in terms of its actual advanced features. It doesn't really have very many. It has very primitive features overall from an evolutionary perspective. But it's amazing to me how these fish have survived, have made it through pretty much over 300 million years of evolution, almost unchanged, which is a testament to how beautiful this fish is and how durable this group of fishes is compared to many others, which only appeared in the fossil record within the last 100 million years or even less, including some tracheids and salmonids. And I'm going to try and convince you in this video that the lamprey is pretty much the coolest fish in North America. You'll never find a fish, in my opinion, that is more fascinating than the various species of lamprey that are found in North American freshwaters. So let's begin. We have a basic understanding of the anatomy of these fish, how they breathe, the different aspects of their biology. We know that they have all the median fins, they lack the lateral line, they lack paired fins, they only have simple gill holes or gill openings. So, and they have no true jaws. They just have a bunch of circular teeth, including a tooth on their tongue. They are very, very unique fishes. To begin, let's talk about the spawning habits of this fish to explain its life cycle and biology. So this is not quite a completely accurate drawing of a specific lamprey in particular. Again, refer to this model to see a more generalized Pacific lamprey. But it's more of a generalized drawing of just what a typical lamprey would look like if it had all the features of every single species of lamprey. That's my representation. It's exaggerated, I know, but it hopefully works. All lampreys, of course, well, not all lampreys, but specific lampreys in particular, begin their life as eggs, as with most fishes. The Pacific lamprey actually begins spawning in April to June when they migrate from the sea into freshwater rivers, often the same river that they were spawned in. The newly hatched juvenile is called an amosete. And amocetes are very interesting creatures. So it's a weird spelling. It's Amocoet. Amocetes. Amocetes are interesting. They actually bury themselves in sand and they sit there and filter feed the entire time. They're similar to the adults, but in some ways not really. They don't have the teeth that adults have. Instead, what an amosete has is an extension of the head that's called an oral hood. And the oral hood is used for filter feeding. They don't have true eyes. They don't have the fully developed eyes of adults. So they really can't see. They can't see. They just sit there for 3 to 7 years and filter feed in the sand, just filtering out microorganisms, detritus, and other such things like that. So they'll live like this for 3 to 7 years of their life, at least in the case of the Pacific lamprey. Some lamprey species can live for 10 plus years as amocetes, but typically for a Pacific lamprey, they'll live like this for 3 to 7 years as an amosete. After they're done living life as an amosete, in late summer, they metamorphose in a sense, or really just transform into a juvenile version of the lamprey. They lose the oral hood. They also develop teeth and eyes, and they become what we call a macrophthalmia. And macrophthalmia is just a fancy word for juvenile lamprey. The macrophthalmia that we see are pretty much miniature versions of the adults. They're parasitic. They can, of course, latch onto other fishes. At least in the case of a Pacific lamprey, they are parasitic. And they'll live like this pretty much for all of that fall and winter into the spring. And so the following spring, what happens is they transform into a fully fledged adult. So they don't really live as a macrophthalmia for a very long time, typically under a year, but they do live as a macrophthalmia for a little while. They just wait until the following winter into the spring so they can make their migratory journey out to sea. So from here, as a macrophthalmia, they become an actual adult. And they go back out to the sea, where they live as parasitic adults in the ocean for 1.5 to 3 years. And they'll just feed on all kinds of fish. Usually they'll feed on salmonids, salmon, and trout. That's the typical animal that they love to feast on. They're not really found in very deep water per se. They've been found to within about 1,000 feet of depth in the ocean and Pacific. And of course, their range includes Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Aleutian Islands, Hokkaido, Japan. So they're found in pretty deep water, but they're not typically type of fish that's found exclusively in the deep water areas. They just go where their prey goes, typically. So they live like this as adults in the ocean for 1.5 to 3 years, and then they'll migrate back up into fresh water streams, usually the same streams that they were spawned in, and they'll spawn once, and then they'll die. In a sense, very similar to what we see in Pacific salmon of the genus Oncorhynchus. They really only have one chance to essentially have sex and make babies and make more fish, and then they die, which is because they expend all their energy in the process of getting to their freshwater natal streams. And of course, they don't really have the energy to go back to sea. Not all of them will necessarily die after spawning. There are some rare cases where a Pacific lamprey could potentially survive, but in most cases, they will die right after spawning. And then the whole cycle begins again. The eggs hatch, the amocetes come out, and they burrow themselves in the sand. filtering out detritus and other microorganisms. They're very interesting creatures. They're just filter feeders. Like I erased previously, but can draw again. They just bury their heads in the sand and they just filter feed for 3 to 7 years. They're highly vulnerable to predators such as sturgeon, white sturgeon in Idaho in particular, that could eat them. They're vulnerable to all kinds of fish and other predators during this time, and also in events that disperse the amociotes out of the water. When they're newly hatched, they're most vulnerable to predation. And so they're just these cute little filter feeders that look similar to the adults, but they just don't have teeth, don't have fully developed eyes, and they just have a nice oral hood. The Pacific's lamprey is very interesting in the sense that they have been very important in the lives of Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest for thousands of years. Unfortunately, because of the tragedy of the Great Lakes with sea lampreys entering in, lampreys generally in North America have been given a bad rap. They've been really persecuted heavily. In fact, early on in the history of this particular fish, the Pacific lamprey, Anthosphenus tridentatus, they were unfortunately fished out pretty heavily. And so today, because of damming, because of overfishing, overharvesting, and pollution in the water, they have been decimated in terms of their population. They're protected in Idaho, they're an endangered species. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game will actually impose pretty serious fines for those who mess with the Pacific lamprey. They're important in the ecosystem as prey. They help to serve as a source of food for other larger fishes. They also help keep in check the populations of larger fish in the ecosystem by sucking blood and other bodily fluids. So they're very important fish. They should not be overlooked at all, these fascinating little lampreys. Adults of this species can reach up to 30 inches, about 30 inches altogether, which is roughly 2.5 feet. And the average is around 20, 21 inches overall. So they get to be a moderate size. In fact, the model that I keep on showing you, it's about a typical sized Pacific lamprey. They can get bigger than that for sure, but it's a good sized one right there. Pacific lampreys, of course, overall can live 10, 11 years in their lifetime. So they have a pretty long life. One thing that's very interesting about the reproductive biology of these fish is that males will develop this urogenital papilla, this very pronounced swollen reproductive gland during the spawning season, but females don't develop the same urogenital papilla during the spawning season, which I find very fascinating about these fish as well. So lampreys in Idaho are not very diverse. There's other places in the country where there's a lot more diverse. The East, in particular, the northeastern, southern region has different states that have a lot more. Pennsylvania has 7 native species of lamprey. Maine only has 1 native species, the sea lamprey. But they're a very interesting and fascinating, diverse group of animals. They all have the same basic shape, same basic design, but there are many different varieties that can be studied in the family Petromyzontidae. So in conclusion, I would like to essentially say that lampreys are fascinating. I think lampreys are among the most interesting and unique fishes or a group of fishes here in North American freshwaters. You can find them all over the place. They never used to be found in the Great Lakes, and now they're found in the Great Lakes. And that's because of human stupidity, why they're found in the Great Lakes at all. But despite the fact that they have caused havoc in some ecosystems, they're still important parts of the ecosystem found here in North America. I hope this video was informative. I know it's not super detailed and not super long, but I love lampreys. I love all fish, and they are the most primitive and some of the most interesting fish that you'll find in North America. Very unique, definitely compared to other fishes, and it's hard to mistake them for anything else, except maybe an eel or a snake, but there's obvious reasons why they wouldn't be an eel or a snake. They have no jaws, they have a circular mouth, and of course they have their distinctive gill openings, the little holes in the side of the head. So stay curious, be wild and free, and hopefully you can go out and catch some lampreys in Idaho. Don't do that because it is illegal to harvest lampreys in this state. But if you're not in Idaho, if you're somewhere else, if it's legal, by all means go out and study lampreys and catch them. I certainly want to do so someday. But in the future, I'll post some updates on different lamprey species in the East and the Midwest and the Great Lakes area and other Western lampreys. And hope to see you next time. And this has been fun. It's awesome. Take care and God bless you all.